And actually, incidentally, it was funny. The nuns told my parents not to let me go to art college because art colleges were dens of sin and vice. I'm
Well,
like, oh, that sounds good.
yeah.
I'm going.
Hello, print friends, and welcome to the 14th episode of Pine Copper Lime, the internet's #1 printmaking podcast. I'm your host, Miranda Metcalf. I release an episode every 2 weeks, and on the off weeks, I publish an article on the Pine Copper Lime website, which features images and maybe a bit more information about the artist I'm going to interview. This week, on a very special episode of Pine Copper Lime, I chat with our grande dame of printmaking, Miss Jenny Robinson. I can't think of a single person who doesn't want to be a little bit more like Jenny. As you'll hear, she has a straightforward confidence and humor, which is a goddamn delight to be around. I've been close with Jenny for about 6 years. We've traveled China together, gotten into all kinds of trouble after hours at SGCIs together, and she's basically the reason I got married, but that's another story. She has an incredible story to tell about her life growing up in Borneo, animating Grace Jones videos in London for a while after art school before traveling around Southeast Asia and India solo, not to mention her recent relocation to Slovenia. Throughout it all, her printmaker pride pervades. Her love of ink and paper runs deep, and it's more than a bit contagious. But before I get to all of that, I promised you a big announcement this week, so here it is. I have launched a Pine Copper Lime online print gallery. Up on pinecopperlime.com, there's now a selection of prints for sale from incredible printmakers from Southeast Asia and Australia, starting at just $150. And for the next month, as a special thank you to all my wonderful PCL supporters, I'm offering you free shipping anywhere in the world with the offer code SHUN. That's right, as in the non-believers. I'm really stoked about the selection of prints I've been able to offer through the amazing studios of Chiang Mai Art on Paper, Jojo Kobe, and Sakata Press. I think it is well worth a look, and it is a great way to support printmakers around the world, and Pine Copper Lime too, of course. There's also some Pine Copper Lime merch you can get through the website, and not to mention, there's the Patreon as well. Or what is amazingly amazing of you is just tell some printmakers about this podcast or leave a review on your app of choice. So, I know that's a lot of asks in a row, but to sum it up, Pine Copper Lime now has an online gallery that you can get free shipping with using the offer code SHUN, S-H-U-N. We have a Patreon with levels and thank yous starting at just $1 a month. And last but certainly not least, just telling people about the pod is one of the most important things you can do to help grow this community. As always, there will be a link in the show notes to all of that. Printmaking forever, shun the non-believers, join the party. And without further ado, here's Jenny.
Hi, Jenny. How's it going?
Hi, Miranda. Lovely to talk to you.
You too. Thanks for joining me.
It's been a while.
It has been. It has been.
We've both moved countries since I saw you last.
I know, no kidding. We went from being an hour flight, 2-hour flight away to other sides of the world. But
yeah, quite literally. Yeah,
we get to meet up here at Pine Copper Lime headquarters digitally.
The best place to meet.
Exactly.
Change is good.
Yeah, for sure. So I know you from working with you at Davidson and showing your work there. And then, you were already represented there when I came on board, but I think that we ended up connecting and we've done some gallivanting around together in China and at different conferences. And
that's right. That's where we first really met. Do you remember we were? I think we were on the same flight coming into Knoxville. I mean, we met in San Francisco, And then we were on the same flight coming into Knoxville, weren't we?
Yeah, and that's when we actually got to to really talk. And then you were at my wedding last year. So it was,
I know, that was a great wedding. That was so much fun.
So yeah, so I feel like I know you pretty well and, done international travel and had adventures in Wuhan train
China.
stations and
Oh boy.
everything.
Oh boy.
But I would love for you to introduce yourself to any listeners who don't know you and just sort of talk about who you are and how you identify as a printmaker or an artist and how you like to be seen.
Okay, well, my name's Jenny Robertson, obviously. I'm originally from England, but I grew up in the Far East in Borneo. And I identify as a printmaker. I know sort of a lot of times people like to sort of open that up a little bit. But I mean, I am a printmaker to my very core. And I think it's important to identify as a printmaker if you are one, because I think printmaking is often seen as I hate to say this, but it's often seen as a sort of the lesser of the big arts, like sculpture, even photography, I think, comes above printmaking these days. And I'm not ashamed of being a printmaker. I am a printmaker and I love being a printmaker. I sort of live and breathe ink. And so for me, it's important to say that's what I am. It's like being an alcoholic, isn't it? I'm a printmaker.
That's right. That's right. Even if you're not currently practicing, you're still a printmaker, even if you're in recovery.
I still go to my meetings.
Yeah.
So I moved to America, God, nearly 20 years ago, actually. We were living in America for 18 years. We moved just a few months before 9/11.
Oh, goodness.
So that was thrilling. So that was a bit of a shock. But yeah, so my whole career, really, my whole serious career. I mean, I had a career in England, but it was sort of up and down because I had kids and, it was all sort of a bit of a mishmash. But everything really started to happen for me once I arrived in San Francisco. So I have very fond feelings for that area.
And that's, where I knew you. And, I sort of knew you as an artist working in San Francisco at Kala.
Kala had a lot to do with my development as an artist, I think, because you have artists from all over the world coming there. And you also have a big core of local artists in residence who work there. It's really a lovely place to be able to work because not only do you get influences from all over the world from printmakers coming in, but you also have a very solid group of people that you see regularly and can exchange ideas with. And so I think it's a really important part of the Bay Area arts. And, it has such amazing presses there and they do a lot for their artists. So yeah, I'm very fond of Kala. It's done a lot for me.
Yeah, this is sort of the second episode that we've had some Kala love. I don't know if you've heard the one with Keith Sekola, who is the...
Oh, yes, I have. He's there at the moment, I think, isn't he? Yeah.
So lots of love from Pine Copper Lime to Kala, it seems like, appropriately. Well, I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about your experiences growing up in Borneo, being an expat and being in a different culture and how you look back on that now.
Well, I mean, it was amazing. I think it's an amazing upbringing for any child to be. I mean, we had a pretty wild upbringing. I've got two sisters and a brother, and they were all born in Borneo. And I was actually born on holiday in Portsmouth, England, which has always been a bit of a chip on my shoulder. I mean, why me? Why did I have to be born in Portsmouth? But yeah, no, it was a wonderful place to grow up as a child. I mean, we would just be running around with hardly any clothes on, playing with the local kids and sort of sitting in drains. And actually, to this day, monsoon rain is my favorite sound. Because, of course, the monsoon is, I don't know if you've ever been in a monsoon rain, but they come down like golf balls. And the sound of it on a tin roof, even now, if I want to go to sleep or something, I'll try and find a tape with golf balls hitting a tin roof, like the monsoon rain, because it's for me, it's such a cozy sound. And, I think just the colours of living on the equator and the rich greens. And it was just a very free childhood. And then that all came to a grinding halt when I was sent to boarding school. I wasn't even 8, actually. I was 7 3/4. And, it was 2 days on a plane to get from Borneo to back to England. And that was probably the biggest culture shock I've ever experienced.
Yeah.
Because growing up with your mum and dad in the tropics and then being sent back to cold, miserable England, it was a shock.
Yeah. Were you even sort of like, how aware of it were you by the time that you were
pretty
sent
aware.
to live there? Okay, so you were familiar with it.
Yeah, we used to, my parents used to go back. I think in those days, my father got leave every 2 or 3 years. So we would go back on the boats. And I have a very clear memory of going back. You'd take a liner, a shipping liner back to Britain. It would take about 3 weeks, stop in Singapore and Bombay and go through the Suez Canal. Back up to England. And then that would be amazing because they'd have parties on the boats with the children and, it was full of people going back to the UK. And then we would stay with my grandparents in Devon. So, yeah, I do have pretty clear memories of that. But then, there weren't really any good schools because we were in Sandakan, which is a logging town up in the north of Borneo. And so all the expats sent their children back to boarding school. So it was quite normal. But we were young. I mean, when I had my own children and I looked at them when they were 7 and 8, I thought, oh, my God, I could never send them away to boarding school. But it was needs must. And I think some people coped well with that, and I think other people didn't. I know some of my siblings didn't cope particularly well with that, but I was all right, actually. I mean, I was always a very homebody. I loved my mum and I loved my dad and I loved being at home, but funnily enough, I kind of thrived at boarding school. I was fine.
With that kind of that context and that backdrop of the tropics and the culture and all of that, what were your early art influences? Do you think that has affected your practice, or was art something that was talked about and upheld in high esteem in your house? Any other artists in the family? How did you sort of find your way to it with that childhood?
No, I wouldn't say that my parents were interested in art. In fact, my father used to say to me, even when I was about 20, he used to say to me, if you can't draw a horse, you're not an artist. And he used to say, can you draw a horse, Jenny? Can you draw a horse? Because if you can't draw a horse, you're not an artist. I'm like, I can draw a bloody horse if I want. I just don't want. I mean, heathen. So, yeah, I mean, my mum was always very supportive. And she, later on in life, she took up Chinese painting and stuff like that. So she has artistic tendencies. My father was an engineer, very practical, but he was also very inventive. But he honestly didn't really have time for faffing around with art. And I think he thought that art was something that I would do before I got married, and then I'd be a nice little housewife, because he came from that generation. So, no, I think it's interesting, actually, you should ask that, because when I went to boarding school, I sort of did a lot of drawing once I got to boarding school, because it was a way of grounding myself or anchoring myself in a new place. And I think when you sit and draw, you really take notice of what's around you and you sort of invest in what's around you. And I think that was a way of coping with the change. I mean, we did have quite a disruptive childhood after that. My parents moved around, they got divorced, and my father went to Africa, and my mother remarried and lived in Singapore. And we were sort of like shuttled around everywhere. And then, I did find that drawing really helped, because it was a way of concentrating on something else and sort of grounding yourself. And I think that's sort of where I started my art has always been about location and where I am and what's around me. Everything I draw is from actual experience of seeing something. And I think that's probably where it all began, is just sort of that idea of grounding yourself in your surroundings. So I think that's really where I started developing an interest in art. And I won a little art prize when I was about 8.5 at school for drawing what did I draw? I drew an acorn or something. No. It was not a horse. It should have been a horse. I might have been taken more seriously in the family if I'd drawn a horse. No, it was a pine cone, actually. I drew a pine cone and I got this prize. And that really encouraged me because, I wasn't getting much encouragement elsewhere. So that was winning that prize. I always look back on that and I always think that was a big deal for me to win that prize
Yeah.
because I don't think I won anything else much, but I did win a prize for drawing a pine cone. So there you are. That's where it all started.
Yeah, with one little pine cone.
One little pine cone. It's quite a big pine cone, actually.
Oh, you've always worked big
Yeah,
then. Yeah.
I do like to work big, yes. So yeah, so I think, and then the nuns, it was a convent I went to, even though we weren't Catholics. My parents left it very late to find a school, and we ended up in a convent, which was interesting because, my parents are complete agnostics, atheists. So yeah, we had to go to Latin Mass. I mean, that was the culture shock bit. We got there from Borneo where we were running around with no clothes on in the rain. And then suddenly we've got to wear black mantillas and go to an hour-long Latin Mass at 6 o'clock in the morning with incense and nuns, they were wearing the full penguin outfits in those days.
I mean, I can't even imagine where you thought you must have been transported to.
It was weird. It certainly cured me of religion for the rest of my life. I mean, mumbo jumbo or what? That's my own personal opinion, of course.
Yeah. How was it, were you able to connect with the other girls at the school, or were they, were you like the naked heathen from
Oh no,
from
we were
Southeast
all
Asia?
from other countries. We were all expat children, apart from some who came from London and even some from Devon, which we found very bizarre. I mean, why would you send your child to boarding school when you lived 100
Yeah.
miles away? But a lot of us, there were people from this, I don't know, from Fiji and from everywhere,
Oh, okay.
Africa.
Lovely. Yeah.
Yeah. So we all had a lot in common. I mean, it was fine. You just got on with it, really.
This traveling lifestyle, it definitely has stayed with you. And you did some world traveling pretty much on your own, is that right? When you were in your 20s?
Yes, after college, I got a job in London in an animation studio, actually. And then I saved up. I was working in music videos. We did a Grace Jones video.
Really?
Yeah, and we worked on the first Highlander. This is all before anything digital. It was all hand drawn and hand painted. They used to call it paint and trace. It was really boring, but there were a lot of good people in there because they were all from art college, just trying to earn some money. So I saved up. Then I went traveling, and I initially went with my old boyfriend from college, my ex-boyfriend, and he was not the easiest person to travel with, I will have to say. And so I broke up with him travel-wise. I remember in Bombay railway station, I think I said to him, "You can get on any train you like, but not the train I'm getting on." And that was it. And I went off traveling on my own after that. And so I traveled for about a year on my own, and it was fantastic. I just had one of the best years of my life. It was just amazing, just traveling around the world with a backpack, and I went to Burma and China and India, spent 3 months in India, I think, Thailand, all over the place. It was amazing.
And how was that time for you artistically? Were you drawing everything you were seeing? Were you able to connect with other artists?
Well, there weren't many artists traveling, but I took a box of Schminker watercolor paints, and a couple of sketchbooks, and I sketched everywhere. And I think that was also, it trained me to put everything in a sketchbook. So, I've always kept sketchbooks. And the thing I love about drawing and sketching when you're traveling is that, again, it sort of really involves you in the place that you're in. So, I can look at some of my sketchbooks now from when I was traveling in my 20s, and I can remember 100% almost where I was sitting, how many children I had around me, because children come from everywhere when you sit down still for a second in India. And you can just, it's the visual diary. It really takes you back. It's a bit like music, it takes you back to that moment in time where you can almost remember exactly what you were doing when you did that sketch. And I think that's because when you draw like that, you're really concentrating on the images around you, and it's quite an intense hour or half hour or whatever it is you're spending there. So, and you don't often sit still in a place like that for half an hour. When you're traveling, you're moving around a lot. And so I think that really trained me in the importance of drawing and keeping a visual sketchbook of things that that catch your eye and that you're interested in. So yeah, I did. I drew all around the world. It was lovely. And it gives you something else to do other than just sort of wander around eating pancakes or curries or whatever it is you're eating that day. And sort of, it gives you a purpose as well while you're traveling.
Yeah.
And the architecture in India is so beautiful, and the light. I did a lot of watercolors of the way light affect architecture and buildings and patterns, So I think all that was very much part of training myself in a way. It was an extension of my training in how to look at things and what to leave out in a drawing and what to put in a drawing. And I also think watercolor, I did a lot of watercolors after I came back from traveling because I couldn't get access to a print shop. And so the way that I use watercolors led into the way that I make monotypes and make my prints, because it's pretty much the same system and same approach that I take when I make a print as when I make a watercolor. I think I was probably quite a late developer in terms of my career starting, but I always worked and I always had shows and exhibitions. But it was only when I returned to printmaking a bit later, when I got back from my travels, that I really began to get seriously back involved in what I really wanted to do. The watercolors and the drawings just led up to that point where I got back into printmaking, because I did my degree in printmaking. And then after I left college, I really didn't have access to printmaking for a while. So it's all, I just see it all as leading up to wherever you end up, and even now, everything that I do leads to something else that I do. I think it's just a lifetime of training yourself and working, and you just have to work and work.
Yeah, that's a good segue into my next question, which is, how did you come to printmaking? You said you majored in it, and then like a lot of printmakers had that experience of, okay, I'm gone, where's my studio, where's my press, what do I do now? How did you end up coming back to it and having it really take over your art practice?
I think printmaking is one of those things that people completely fall in love with when they take their first printmaking class, or they just haven't got the patience for it. But that happened to me when I went to art college. And actually, incidentally, it was funny. The nuns told my parents not to let me go to art college because art colleges were dens of sin and vice. Well, I'm like, oh, that sounds good.
Yeah.
I'm going. So I went to art college, where I suppose I was supposed to learn to draw a horse. So, when in England, when you do a foundation course, basically you do everything. You do ceramics, you do a bit of sculpture, you do this, that, and the other. And when I took my printmaking section, which was in the second semester, I just completely fell in love with it. I was like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And so then I applied for a degree, and then I did my degree. Because in those days in England, there weren't that many solely printmaking degrees. So I ended up staying in a smallish college outside London, and I did my degree there. And then when I left, like you say, it was hard to get access to printmaking. So I got a job in animation in Soho in London, and that was great. I earned quite a lot of money. Then I went traveling, and then I came back, and I couldn't stand being in England, so I went traveling again. And then I came back, and it was around that point where I really wanted to get back to work. And actually, after I left college, I shared a studio opposite the British Museum with some college friends of mine. And one of the lovely things about the British Museum, and this is also something we did when I was at college, was they have a printmaking study room where you can contact them and they'll let you come in and see any prints that you want. And they have got a massive selection of prints in the V&A and in the British Museum. Mm-hmm. But I remember when I was at college, we used to do that. We would go up there and the tutor would pick out prints for us to look at. And one of the group of prints that we looked at was the Rembrandt Three Crosses, the ones where he changes the way he wipes it and adds to it and just creates almost like monoprints. And they have 5 or 6 of those in the British Museum. And I remember when I saw those, it was almost a turning point, because when you learn traditional printmaking, especially back when I did my degree, you'll learn to do it traditionally and properly, which I think is really important. but you're supposed to make, 20 prints identical and do an
Right. Yeah.
addition, which is the traditional way of making prints. And I really never had patience for that. I always wanted to try new things and, cut up my plates or whatever. And when I saw those Rembrandts, I was like, well, if Rembrandt could do it back in the day, if he can just make 5 prints that are completely different. So that was a lovely thing to be able to see as well, that even back in the centuries ago, people were experimenting like that. Because I honestly think experimentation is the future for printmaking. And of course, that's what it is now. Printmaking is everything and anything. Then I bought my own press. That's right. After the boys were born. And that's when I started working on drypoint more, because I didn't want any toxic materials around. And so I bought a little press, a Rolico press, from a guy up in north of England who makes these amazing little presses. And so then I started printmaking in my studio again. I bought this little press and I started doing dry points. And that's really when I completely fell in love with printmaking again. And then I've never looked back since then. And then, when I moved to the States, I went to Calar, and they had that huge press at Calar, which also opened up a whole new chapter of my work, because I was able to work at the scale, finally, that I really wanted to. So it's all these little things that happen to you in life where, I bought my little press, and I started printmaking again, and then we moved to America, and I had access to a massive press, a bigger press than I'd ever seen before. And that enabled me to then really take off and do what I really wanted to do, which was to create these large prints.
This does seem like a perfect time to move into talking specifically about your work. And, there's definitely, of course, there's more than 2 sides to it, but, there's technical aspect of it, that you've really got a technique that you've really, developed yourself, and of course are invited to do workshops on at SGCI and that sort of thing. But then also there's the imagery and the scale and all of that as well, and then the aesthetic side of it. So I'm sure that people would love to hear about both. Do you want to maybe describe a little bit the Jenny Robinson method?
So when I bought my little press in England, I went down. There's a really great shop in London called Intaglio Printmakers. They're like a little Dickensian shop in South London. And I was in there sort of just like drooling over all the printmaking stuff. And they were selling these paper plates for dry point. So I bought a couple of them. And so that's really when I started drawing on dry point plates, because, it was very fast. It sort of was like an extension of a sketchbook. You didn't have to worry about the cost. And they worked well for 2 or 3 prints, but they were a little rough around the edges, I felt. So I did that for a while. And then when I moved to the States, I was teaching for a little bit. And I was pretty shocked at how expensive it was for students, because they had to buy their own copper, and the cost of just a printmaking course, or the cost of university, it was so high, because of course I had a completely free education, and we were given most of our plates by the college. So it was a shock to see how much more expensive an education in America was from what I had had. At that time, I was working at Calar, and I was developing ways of making really big plates, but without using metal, without investing all that money in copper and stuff. So I just did a lot of experimentation of how to do these paper plates, but make them a little bit more durable than the ones I'd used in the UK. So I just tried a bunch of different materials, and I eventually landed on illustration board and wood varnish, which worked amazingly well. In some ways, I was trying to save the students money by giving them something that wasn't intimidating to them in terms of cost, and would allow them to work much larger if they wanted to, and much quicker. And also to allow myself to work much larger for a much cheaper approach, because, I'm only getting 5 or 6 prints out of each plate. And at that time, I could get hold of 60 by 40 pieces of cardboard, which worked really well. And then later on, they changed the makeup and were using much cheaper materials. So it stopped working. And that was around the time when I started working a bit more on aluminium and stuff. But it's a really, it's a great thing to teach beginning printmaking on, as well as doing more intricate prints, because it's just so accessible. And you can make a 60 by 40 plate in 2 or 3 days, where can you imagine how long that would take you if it was an etching?
Right.
It would take you months, literally. And I do think that experimentation and breaking those traditional ideas of printmaking is kind of the way forward for printmaking. And I think we've seen that in the last 10 years with all the innovations that young printmakers are coming up with, installation printing and all sorts of things. I mean, I think printmaking is such an exciting area of the arts at the moment. You know, there's so much going on with works on paper. So that's really how I started working like that. And then, you know, I took a course with Paul Maloney when I was doing these really big prints, and I started working on Gampi. And I didn't really know what to do with the paper, with the Gampi paper. So Paul, we did this workshop with Paul, and he showed me how to back Gampi paper.
Right, yeah.
And big size too, and also how to seam prints together. And, you know, that workshop was such a eye-opener for me. And it changed the way that I worked. I mean, I hardly work on Western paper at all now, because it just opened up this whole new way of making prints. And that's really when I started getting into sort of joining prints together and playing with symmetry and mirror images and tessellation, which also reflects the way that prints are actually made. I mean, when you pull a print, you have that perfect symmetry as the paper comes off the plate.
Right.
And I love that idea that you're sort of playing with that whole idea of repetition, mirror images, and all that stuff.
So what was it about the Gampi that, you know, you sort of say that it definitely changed things for you? I'd love to hear you talk more about that.
Let me see, how did I first get into Gampi? So I think that was another thing about being in a communal print shop, is that you witness everybody working in different ways. And I think I was part of a crit group, and so we all talk about paper and paper choices, and some of us were making artist books on different kinds of Japanese paper. And then I just got this yen to make one of my really big prints, a 60 by 40 print on a really thin paper. And some people at Kalar had the Gampi, and I was looking at it. So I bought a big roll of it. And what really drew me to it when I did my first print on Gampi was the counterbalance, in a way, between this beautiful, fragile, weightless paper, which is so strong, actually. It's sort of, you don't think it's going to be strong, but it's really strong, but it's also really fragile. And that really played into my subject matter, which is about the transient and the impermanence of the urban environment. And so I love the idea of having these weighty images on this really delicate paper, which is also strong. So the environment is fragile, but looks strong, and the paper is strong but looks fragile. And so I really like that counterbalance between those two, the image and the paper. So that's really where Gampi started to be really an important choice for my work, because it does play into that whole environmental idea that, you know, we have to look after our environment, our urban environments as well, and that they are much more fragile than they seem. You know, using a paper that reflects that, I think, is very important to the work as well, to get that idea across.
Yeah, this is a good place to talk about the actual specific imagery that you're using, which, when I first came to know you and your work, it was, you know, these very large scale prints of older buildings, silos, you know, kind of airplanes, really monolithic structures that were in decay. And now your work, just in the last few years, has taken this turn where you're starting to literally deconstruct the images as well, and, you know, doing a printing that, as you say, kind of mirrors that experience of the actual pulling off the plate, but can go several directions, but still has that really structural, strong quality that it's these skeletons now of what you were making before.
Yeah, no, that's a very good summary of what it is. Because, the other thing I feel like is you have to keep pushing your ideas within your own practice. So 10 years ago, I was doing those very big, like you say, decaying structures, because those were the things that I was driving past every day on my way to my studio. And those are the things that really grab my interest, is maybe a structure on its own, just with that patina of age and the corrosion that you get from the environment on a structure. So I was really interested in all of that. And also the way the light falls on it. Things look so different in the evening from in the morning. You might not even notice something in the morning, but you'll see it in the evening when the light hits it in a different way. And things like the billboards, I would be driving past all these billboards on my way across the Bay Bridge and coming back, and the way the light hits them at certain times of the day, and the fact that they're such an iconic part of the American landscape also really interested me, but not what was on the front, obviously, because that's really banal in so many ways. But, what was holding it up, what holds up that idea of the American dream. And then that led into, the building boom that's been going on all around the world, and especially in San Francisco and London and Sydney, places like that. And, what really was catching my eye then was these skeletal structures that are going up or coming down. And it's that idea that you really don't know what state these things are in because of the constant change, that impermanence. So then I started working in a more linear way, I think. And I was experimenting more with collaging a few bits and pieces and then tessellating these images. And so that's really what I'm interested in now, and also sort of doing these repeat images, because that's another thing with Gampi, is that you can read it from the back as well as the front.
Yeah.
And then when I realized that, put a little bit of burnt plate oil in there or whatever, and then you've got this complete mirror image that you can join together. You can take images that are rooted in observation and drawing again, and then you can change them and create something that's based on that reality, but it takes on a more ambiguous shape, if you like. It's recognizable, but it's not quite what you think it is. And I'm just really enjoying that idea of being a little bit more abstract with my work and sort of just taking it where it goes and sort of playing on those ideas of symmetry, tessellation, repetition, all the things that are involved in the printmaking process itself.
And where do you think that kind of impulse came from to start to really deconstruct the images and really move to, in some cases, almost complete abstraction?
Again, I think it was from observation, and I started to simplify my drawings a bit more. And I think actually a lot of it stems back to, I went down the peninsula in San Francisco. There's this huge airship building, Hangar 1, down at Moffett Airfield, and Google recently, well, not recently now, but about 10 years ago, had leased it, and they had taken off the skin. So it was just sitting in this field off the freeway, like this massive dinosaur, or, like a skeleton. And that, I went down there and did some drawing and took some photographs. And then I did a whole body of work that just came off that. So my first print of that was a literal drypoint, which was about 24 by 27 or something. And I kind of just thought of that as a study. So I did a drypoint of that. And then I realized that if I sort of printed it on Gampi and I moved it around and sort of put pieces together, I could create this different architectural monolith, if you like, that was based from that, but that had its own entity, that it had its own character. And that sort of then led to a whole bunch of work that was more in keeping with that, was just taking parts or details of a building and then creating my own constructs, if you like, using symmetry and recognition. And I like that idea that people look at it and they recognize it, but they don't know where from. But they also appreciate that it's its own architectural shape now. And so that, I think that's just, I think it's comes from this idea of not wanting to stand still and do what you're comfortable with. I reached a point with the other prints where I just felt really comfortable with them and I knew I could do them. And I wanted to try something else. I wanted to push myself a bit more and try something different. And I think that's always scary when you're an artist, because if you're selling your work, it's a bit of a leap of faith to then sort of change it a little bit, because I rely on selling my work to make my living. So to change it it's a bit scary. But then you think, well, you don't want to be doing the same thing day after day. You want to try new things and see if they work for you. And after all, I do my work for myself. I don't do it for other people. I've been lucky in the fact that people like my work and will buy it. But at the end of the day, it's really what I want to do with my work that keeps me going. Otherwise, why bother, honestly, if you're just doing it to sell it.
Yeah, I can see that. It's sort of like if you're not interested in your work and you're just producing it because it's what sells, it's like you may as well be doing anything.
You may as well paint a bunch of flowers or something, which of course is what people expect from women artists anyway, generally.
Yeah. Flowers and horses.
Flowers and horses, yes. Unicorns.
Yes.
I mean, honestly, Miranda, I can't tell you how many men, usually, have come into my studio and asked me where the artist is, even though I'm the only person in the room and my name is above the door.
Right.
And they'll come in and they'll say, oh, where's the artist? And you go, oh, well, actually, I'm the artist. And they go, no, this work looks like it's been done by a man.
It's terrible.
I know. And then, there are times when Stuart might be in the room with me, my husband, and they'll talk to him and they'll say, oh, is this your work? And he'll say, no, it's my wife's. But then they'll talk to him.
Yeah.
They'll say, oh, how many pounds per inch does this press? Blah, blah. And you're like, oh, my God. I mean, I think that's the thing. Until more recently, anyway, I don't think the art world expects women to do work that's more structural or, architectural. I think we're still fighting against that image of what women are interested in or what women should be doing.
Yeah, I remember you telling me that about the open studios that you would have in San Francisco, and it just seems completely inconceivable that it is inconceivable to them that a woman can be making large, strong, structural work. Yeah, it's just...
I know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's getting less. I'm glad to say it sort of becomes less and people are a little bit more aware, I think, that it's a stupid thing to say. But,
yeah, now they can just think it. But yeah, like as we sort of touched on before, you're actually not in San Francisco anymore. You were in Slovenia at the moment, correct?
Yes, that's right. We moved over here for 2 years in November. Can't believe we've been here 4.5 months already. But yeah, we chose Slovenia. Berlin would have been amazing, but we couldn't swing it. We could have moved to Paris, but we wanted to be in this part of the world. And I have to say, it is a lovely part of the world to be in. It's a wonderful part of Europe. We're very lucky because we're close to a lot of beautiful European cities. I mean, for instance, I went to Venice for the day the other day, and we've been to Milan, and this weekend we're going back to Vienna, where we were a few weeks ago. And so it's very, it's a lovely place to spend 2 years.
Well, definitely. And while you're there, you must have access to like the museums, of course, of Europe, and going there and getting to see that. And that must be super enriching for any artistic practice.
It is, and it's nice to have the choice of museums that you want. In fact, it's funny that you should mention that, because I read on Hyperlergic that there was a Egon Schiele centenary exhibition on at the Leopold Museum in Vienna. So we went to see that, and it was called Egon Schiele Reloaded, and it was like the centennial of his birth or death or something. And so we went in, we paid our €10 and we got got the information. So basically it was putting modern art with Egon Schiele's work, and they did it by...
Interesting idea. Because it's...
Yeah, and it was a really interesting exhibition until we got into a room where they started to show his watercolors, which I was very excited about seeing, and his prints, of course.
Yeah.
And so I was looking at this first drawing, watercolor drawing. And, the beautiful thing about watercolor drawings is the texture of the paper and the marks, the charcoal. You can see it, you can really see it.
You can see the way the water has like really seeped in different layers in the paper. And And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, whoa, what's this? And it was
just really flat and on sort of very flat paper, and it said facsimile on the edge of it, and I'm like,
Oh,
what? And I thought, oh, well, maybe they couldn't, because the Leopold actually has this huge collection of his drawings. I mean, they have one of the biggest collections, I think, of his work. And this is a big exhibition. I think it's traveled all over the place. And then I looked at the next drawing and it was the same. And I realized that every single drawing and work, every single piece of the works on paper in that show was basically a photocopy. And it wasn't even a very good photocopy. I mean, it was basically they'd taken a photo of it and it was all framed up beautifully and stuff. But the quality was just awful. It was on this sort of slightly off white paper. And it
yeah,
was really, really disappointing. And it really got my blood boiling, actually, because I
of
thought,
course.
this is a rip-off. I could have gone into the bookshop and looked, and I probably would have seen better reproductions.
Yeah.
And even the etchings were facsimiles as
Oh,
well.
that would be heartbreaking. Like if I had the opportunity where I thought I was going to go see his etchings and they turned out
Mhm.
to be reproductions, I would be devastated.
I know. And what's the point? I mean, the thing with etchings too is you get the embossment on the
Oh,
paper and
all
you
of
get the
it.
ink sitting on the paper. I mean, and they were not. So actually, I started, bitching away to my husband about it. And I said, I'm going to say something about this because, this cost us €10 to get in. Anyway, so when we left, I went up to the desk and I said, could you tell me why all the works on paper are reproductions? And she said, and actually the woman got very defensive right off the bat. And she said, well, they're very good reproductions. And I
Mm.
said, well, not really. Um, uh, she said, no, they're very, very, very good reproductions, and most people can't tell the difference. And I said, yeah, but they're reproductions, and they're all framed up and stuff, and she was just saying, oh well, she said, you do realize that works on paper are very fragile, and I said, yes. And she said, well, we can't just take them out for any exhibition, but this is like this big exhibition. And I said, but you can put museum glass on them and you can
Yeah.
lower the lighting and stuff. And she said, well, no, we're just not going to take the works out and just show them because, they'll get damaged and stuff. And I thought, well, bloody hell, that's just not on. It's just very uncool to have a museum of that standing showing works that are poor reproductions when they have the actual original works on paper in their archives. I just don't
Yeah.
get it.
Well,
What's the point?
and what I find so disturbing about it, just despite the personal disappointment that people who know what they're looking at must be experiencing, is for the people who don't know what they're looking at, how are they ever going to fall in love with works on paper if they are being spoon-fed reproductions and being told that it's the same experience? Because, of course, it's very much
Oh,
not.
it's like a McDonald's versus a Michelin star restaurant,
Yes, yes.
meal. I mean, it's just I don't know. I just don't understand it. And I think it plays into that whole dumbing down of works on paper. They're
Yeah,
not as important. You don't have to see the real thing. Who needs to see a work on paper when you've got a painting next to it? You know? Oh,
yeah.
it gets me blood boiling, Miranda. It gets me blood boiling.
Yeah, they're just treated in this way. That's like, well, of course, like almost like, well, people aren't really going to look closely enough at them anyway. That
Yeah, because they're
that
just works on paper.
people aren't going to know the difference. This sort of thing.
Well,
Um,
and that's true
yeah.
in a way because I've pointed out to my husband, he's not an artist, he's an engineer, and I pointed out to him, and he said, "Oh, I wouldn't really have noticed that unless you
Mm,
pointed out, but now that you pointed out, I can see that that's not good,
yeah.
doesn't look good."
And
So
people
yeah,
can, like, even if
uh,
they don't have that eye of having been around paper so much, once you point it out, anyone can see it, and anyone can see that it is a photocopy that's not fulfilling that aesthetic, lovely burning heart of love, I guess, that you can get for
exactly.
paper.
Honestly, I was in the V&A a few weeks ago when I was in London. we were in this dark corridor, and they had these original Beatrix Potter drawings of Peter
Oh,
Rabbit. And they were the originals. And honestly, Miranda, you could look at them and they were just so beautiful. The paper and the
yeah,
delicate watercolors. I mean, the difference was chalk and cheese
yeah,
between, and they were just up in a dark corridor in the V&A. They weren't being overly precious about it. Obviously, they had the lights down and, but that's the difference between a big museum showing really not very good reproductions on flat pieces of paper and the real thing. Yeah, so that is something that really sort of gets me a bit irate when I see things like that. I think my poor husband had to put up with me wittering on about it all through dinner, and the more I drank, the more I got irate.
of course, of course. When I was traveling in sort of Northern Europe years ago, I took a special trip to Vienna to see Dürer's hair watercolor because I knew
Right.
that the Albertina had it. And I was so excited to go see it, and we got to the museum later than we were hoping to, and it seemed like it was going to close. And so I asked the guard, where can I see the Dürer's watercolors, and ran upstairs to the third floor and found them, and they were reproductions. They were
Again.
again, and I was so heartbroken because we hadn't even planned on coming to Vienna at all. But I had asked my friend who I was traveling with, can we go and do this? I've just always wanted to see these. We're so close. Let's just do it, because we were just in Germany at the time. And it was, in looking back, it's like, okay, yeah, I can see why they may not have a watercolor on display, because where it had been stationed was getting direct sunlight from an open window. But
Well,
I'm
that's a
just like,
stupid place to put
yeah,
anything anyway.
just don't put it there. Like, put it somewhere, like you say, it's like a little darker corridor, put it under the museum glass and let people have that experience that they've traveled for, that they've paid for, that they've been looking for, that sort of release and satisfaction and love that you feel when you do see a truly beautiful work on paper in person. There's nothing else like it.
I know. And it just seems counterproductive to, send people to the bookshop
Right.
if you're going to do that, because the reproductions in a good book are probably better anyway. But yeah, it just seems very weird that that's the way they treat works on paper in these massive museums. I mean, especially when they have the originals in their vaults,
Right.
Have they not heard of special lighting in museums and
Yeah.
museum glass? Have they not heard of these things?
Sort of like,
I know.
this is your job, right? Museums, like,
Yeah, you can show these things, by the
yeah,
way.
yeah,
Just
you
don't
are
put them in
allowed.
sunlight and get a grip.
Oh, how disappointing.
I know. So, it does make you wonder really what's going on when they do that. But
Yeah. It's why we
yeah.
need podcasts about printmaking, so people can know the truth.
Yes, and that is why. And by the way, Miranda, at this point, I do want to say thank you to you for setting this up, because I think it's so important to have a podcast about printmakers for printmakers. And, hopefully some of the general public will jump on board too and learn a thing or two and learn how important works on paper are.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I do have a bit of a dream that I might convince just some podcast browsing people to jump on board as well, and hear all the interesting things that we're doing and get a sense of the great community that we have, and maybe
I,
inspire them to
and
take up something.
and maybe some painters might learn a thing or two were they to listen.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
No pressure, painters, no pressure,
no
but
pressure painters. I was about to say, I was like, I mean, I'm not holding my breath for painters, but yeah.
I know. There's a whole world of works on paper out there, painters.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We're thriving. So speaking of thriving, what's on the horizon for you? You've got your new continent. You've got a press that you're going to be working with now, and what are you looking forward to?
Well, I think, we're going to be here for 2 years. And then my long-term plan, as you know, I may have told you this before, Miranda, but I do want to drop dead at my press when the time comes, not too soon, but obviously in my dotage, that's the way I want to go. And so we're thinking of setting up an artist residency. Obviously we don't have the details yet. We haven't even decided on the country where we will do it. But we went to a beer garden the other day and had a long talk about it. And we've definitely decided to do it. So it's just a case of where.
Beautiful.
It'll be soon, I think. It'll probably be within 3 years. We'll start to look to set it up. And I think the main draw that I'm interested in for this particular residency is I think we want to buy a really big press. And that will be the focus of the residency, I think, to enable people. Because not every place has got a big press. And so I think that will be our main focus, is to have access to a really large press so that people can work on a large scale. Yeah, so it's very exciting. So we just have to decide where. So I think that's what we're going to do.
Well, I think that is a lovely place to finish up. Where can people find out more about you? Where can they see your work and follow you and all your adventures?
I'm on Instagram under Jenny Robinson Prints, and I have a website, jennyrobinson.com. And that's pretty much where you'll find most of my information.
Great. Well, I will put links to all of that in the show notes. And thank you so much. It has been such a pleasure to chat and catch up a bit, but then also learn things about you I didn't even know after years of friendship.
Thanks very much for inviting me, and I've really, really enjoyed it.
Oh,
it's been
good.
Lovely.
I can't wait to talk more. So, all right. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Miranda.
Bye.
Well, that's our show for this week. Join me again in 2 weeks' time when my guest will be Aaron Coleman. We talk about his early art influences of hip-hop culture growing up outside of Chicago, and how the sampling of music and imagery present affects his current practice, as well as art making as a political act and the often unseen labor done by Black and brown people in academia. This episode, like all episodes, was written and produced by me, Miranda Metcalf, with editing help by Timothy Pauschak and music by Joshua Weber. I'll see you in 2 weeks.